Part 1. In the spring of 1945, a man was admitted to the University of Chicago's Billings Hospital, complaining of severe bone deterioration. He was 53 years old, a former construction worker, and had been referred through a chain of medical contacts that, on paper, looked entirely routine. His name was Eb Cade. He was assigned patient number HP12, the HP standing in the internal documentation of the Manhattan Project's medical division for human product. The records indicate that within days of his admission, before his fractures had been properly set, before his consent had been formally established under any framework that would later be recognized as ethical, he was injected with 4.7, a micrograms of plutonium-239. The attending physicians noted his physiological responses over the following weeks. Bone samples were extracted. 15 of his teeth were pulled, without clinical necessity, for spectrographic analysis. Then, in April of 1945, Eb Cade discharged himself from the hospital. He never returned. His long-term follow-up data, if it was ever compiled, was not made part of the public record. What stands out is not only what happened to Eb Cade, but the precision with which it was documented in the months immediately following, and the systematic incompleteness of that documentation in the decades that came after. The Manhattan Project's medical team, operating under the direction of the Army Corps of Engineers and staffed by researchers drawn from the country's most prestigious academic institutions, was engaged in a parallel mission alongside the development of the atomic bomb itself. That mission was physiological. It was an attempt to understand what plutonium, a substance that had existed in isolatable quantities for fewer than 4 years, would do to the human body when introduced directly into the bloodstream. Animal studies had been conducted, rodent models had been established. But the data, according to internal correspondence recovered decades later, was considered insufficient for what the program's administrators described as operational projections. The phrase appears in at least 3 separate memos produced between late 1944 and mid-1945. What operational projections required, the correspondence suggests, was human data that could not be obtained any other way. The program operated under the administrative umbrella of the Manhattan Engineering District, with direct oversight connections to the Army Medical Corps and, more loosely, to what would later become the Atomic Energy Commission. It was not conducted in secret in the way that term is sometimes loosely applied. There were records, there were memos, there were researchers with names and institutional affiliations. What made it function in a kind of operational obscurity was the classification structure that surrounded it. The research existed inside a system where the patients had no access to what was being studied, where the physicians conducting the injections were bound by national security protocols that superseded standard medical disclosure, and where the results, when compiled, were routed not through standard medical publication channels, but through internal government reporting structures. The data does not fully align with what one would expect from a parallel medical program of this scale, not in terms of sample size, not in terms of follow-up duration, and not in terms of the completeness of the outcomes that were eventually recorded. Eb Cade's case was the first. The injection took place on April 10, 1945, 3 months before the Trinity test in New Mexico, 4 months before the detonation at Hiroshima. The war was not yet over, the weapon was not yet proven, and the men directing the medical research program had already concluded that waiting for peacetime conditions or for the development of formal consent frameworks was not compatible with the timeline of what they were building. This is not speculation constructed retrospectively. It is present in condensed form in the language of the program's own administrative communications that remained classified for nearly 5 decades. When they were finally declassified in the early 1990s, following a series of investigative reports and a formal inquiry ordered by the Department of Energy, what emerged was not a complete picture. It was, as the review panel noted in its 1995 final report, a partial record, sufficient to confirm the broad outline of what had occurred, but incomplete in ways that made definitive accounting impossible. Certain case files had been transferred, others had been consolidated, some simply did not appear in the archives where they were expected to be found. The first disturbance in examining this record is not the existence of the program. Programs of this kind, embedded inside the architecture of wartime scientific mobilization, have analogs in multiple countries and multiple conflicts. The disturbance is the follow-up, or, more precisely, the absence of it. A medical experiment, however conducted, generates data across time. Plutonium, as the researchers themselves noted in their preliminary assessments, has a half-life of approximately 24,100 years. Its biological behavior inside the human body was understood, even in 1945, to be a long-term phenomenon, one that would manifest across decades in the tissues, the bones, the lymphatic system. If the purpose of the injections was to generate physiological data, then the logical structure of that purpose required longitudinal observation. It required follow-up. What the records show, in case after case, is that the follow-up either did not occur, was not preserved, or was conducted in a form that was never released to the public, to independent researchers, or to the patients themselves. The question of why a program designed to generate data would permit that data to disappear is one that the available record does not answer clearly. Part 2. Ebb Cade was not the only one. This was not an isolated case, and the documentation, fragmented as it is, makes that much clear. Between the spring of 1945 and the summer of 1947, at least 18 individuals were injected with plutonium or other radioactive isotopes, including polonium, uranium, and americium, as part of what the Manhattan Project's medical division categorized under the broad heading of tracer studies. The hospitals involved were not peripheral institutions. They included the University of California Hospital in San Francisco, Strong Memorial Hospital in Rochester, New York, and the University of Chicago's medical complex, all of them research universities with deep contractual relationships with the federal government's wartime science apparatus. The physicians involved held faculty appointments, published in peer-reviewed journals, and in several cases went on to receive significant federal research funding in the post-war period. The records indicate that the program was not conducted by rogue actors operating at the margins of institutional science. It was embedded, structurally, inside the center of American academic medicine. The case files, where they survive, follow a pattern that becomes difficult to ignore once it has been observed across more than 2 or 3 instances. A patient is admitted, typically for a condition unrelated to radiation exposure. The patient is described in internal documents using an identifier, a number, or a code designation, rather than a name. A medical justification is noted, but the justification, when examined, often does not correspond in any clear clinical logic to the administration of a radioactive substance. The injection is carried out. Biological samples, blood, urine, occasionally bone, are collected at intervals. The patient is observed for a defined period, ranging from days to several weeks, and then the record thins. In some cases, it stops entirely. What is present in the documentation is the administration of the substance and the initial physiological response. What is largely absent is anything that would allow an independent researcher to trace the long-term health outcome of the individual who received it. One of the more thoroughly documented cases involves a patient referred to in the records as CAL1, admitted to the University of California Hospital in San Francisco in mid-1945. The patient was described as a male, middle-aged, with a diagnosis that internal documents characterize vaguely as a systemic condition. He received an injection of plutonium-239, and his urine output was monitored for excretion data. The researchers noted the percentage of the administered dose that was excreted in the days following the injection. This data was, from a purely scientific standpoint, what the program was designed to collect: information about how the human body processes and retains plutonium, which was critical for establishing exposure thresholds for the workers at the production facilities in Hanford, Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The internal logic of the program, in other words, was not entirely detached from a form of utility. The workers at those facilities were being exposed to radioactive materials under conditions that were not fully understood, and the medical division was attempting, through these studies, to establish what a safe or tolerable level of exposure might look like. The problem with that framing, and it is a problem that the records themselves create, not one imposed from outside, is that the subjects of the study were not the workers at risk. They were hospital patients, admitted for other conditions, who in most documented cases showed no evidence of having been informed of what was being administered to them, why it was being administered, or what the known or suspected effects might be. The program's own internal correspondence contains at least 2 exchanges in which the question of patient awareness is raised and then set aside on the grounds that full disclosure would compromise the integrity of the data collection. Specifically, that patients who understood they were receiving a radioactive substance might alter their behavior in ways that affected urine and blood, collection compliance. This reasoning appears in a memo dated late 1945. It was written by a named researcher. That researcher continued to publish in American medical journals for the following 2 decades. Similar reports began appearing across the archive when the Department of Energy's review process gathered materials in the early 1990s. A patient at Strong Memorial in Rochester, identified in the surviving file only by initials and age, received a plutonium injection in late 1945 and was discharged several weeks later. A follow-up appointment was scheduled, according to a single line in the case log. Whether it occurred is not recorded. Another patient, elderly, with a terminal cancer diagnosis that the researchers appear to have used as a medical ethical justification for inclusion in the study, survived considerably longer than the prognosis in his admission file suggested he would. His extended survival would have represented, from a scientific standpoint, a significant longitudinal data opportunity. An individual who received a plutonium injection and continued living. The records do not indicate that this opportunity was pursued in any systematic way. His file closes abruptly in the late 1940s. If follow-up data was generated, it was not included in the materials that were eventually transferred to the archive. If you have been following these patterns across the available documentation, you begin to notice a particular consistency in the shape of the gaps. Not random omissions distributed across all categories of information, but a specific and recurring absence at the point in each case file where long-term outcome data would be expected to appear. The initial data is present. The methodology is documented. The rationale is stated, however inadequately. What is missing, in case after case, is the part that would allow a researcher, or a patient's descendants, to understand what the injection ultimately did to the person who received it. This is not a pattern that emerges from a single institutional failure or a single individual's decision. It is consistent enough, and it appears across enough separate institutions and enough separate case files to suggest that the absence of follow-up data was not accidental. Part 3. To understand how a program of this kind persists across multiple institutions without generating the kind of institutional friction that typically surfaces irregularities, it is necessary to look at the structure that contained it, not the individuals who administered the injections, but the system that made their decisions invisible to the mechanisms that might otherwise have. Question them. The Manhattan Project's medical division operated under a classification framework that was, by its design, self-sealing. The researchers who conducted the studies were cleared personnel. The hospitals that hosted them operated under contractual agreements with the federal government that included confidentiality provisions. The data generated by the studies was classified at its point of creation, which meant that it did not enter the normal circulation of scientific knowledge, peer review, replication, independent analysis, through which errors, ethical violations, and anomalies are typically identified and addressed. The system was not designed to suppress the research. It was designed to contain it. The suppression, where it occurred, was a consequence of that containment, rather than a separately organized effort. What is more difficult to account for is what happened after the war ended. The Manhattan Project was formally dissolved in 1946, and its functions were transferred to the newly created Atomic Energy Commission. The medical research programs, including the records generated by the human injection studies, were transferred along with them. The AEC was a civilian agency, technically. Its leadership was appointed by the executive branch. Its budget was approved by Congress, and its mandate included the promotion of peaceful uses of atomic energy alongside the maintenance of the nation's nuclear weapons program. It was also, from its inception, a classification authority. It had the power to designate information as restricted data under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and that power was applied broadly. The records of the human plutonium studies fell within that designation. They remained there for decades. The section of the AEC's post-war research archive that would have contained the longitudinal follow-up data, if that data existed, was not made available to outside researchers. No official explanation was provided for the specific contours of what was withheld and what was released. The timeline becomes difficult to ignore when it is placed alongside the development of what would later become the regulatory infrastructure for human subjects research in the United States. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947 in the wake of the trials of Nazi physicians, articulated for the first time in international legal terms the principle that voluntary consent is an absolute necessity in human experimentation. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, elaborated those principles further. The National Research Act of 1974, passed in the aftermath of the public disclosure of the Tuskegee syphilis study, established the Institutional Review Board system that now governs human subjects research at federally funded institutions. Each of these developments was, in part, a response to documented failures that became public through a specific mechanism, disclosure. And in each case, the failures that prompted the regulatory response were ones where the documentation had survived and been made accessible. The plutonium injection studies present a different case. The program was contemporaneous with Nuremberg. It was ongoing during the period when the international medical community was establishing the ethical standards that the United States government publicly endorsed. The AEC, in its public communications during the late 1940s and 1950s, issued statements about its commitment to responsible research and the protection of research subjects. Internally, the records indicate that discussions were occurring about the liability implications of the injection program, not its ethics specifically, but the legal and institutional exposure that might result if the program became publicly known. A memorandum from the late 1940s, recovered during the 1993 review process, references the importance of ensuring that the program's documentation was handled appropriately. The phrase is not elaborated. The memo's author is identified by name in the recovered document, but the portions of the file that would have clarified the specific handling being referenced were not among the materials transferred to the public archive. The connections between the injection program and broader institutional structures extend beyond the AEC. Several of the researchers involved in the 1945 and 1946 studies went on to hold significant positions in the post-war scientific establishment. One became a senior figure in the National Institutes of Health's Radiation Research Division. Another maintained a long-term consulting relationship with the AEC through the 1950s and 1960s, a period during which the Commission was conducting additional human radiation experiments, some of which were later documented by the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments in its 1995 report. That report, which ran to nearly 1,000 pages and drew on millions of declassified documents, was notable for what it confirmed and for what it explicitly acknowledged it could not determine. The committee found that the original plutonium injection subjects had never been identified to receive notification or follow-up. It found that several case files were incomplete. It found that the long-term health outcomes of the majority of the 1945 subjects could not be established from the available record. The section of the report dealing with the completeness of the transferred archive noted, in careful institutional language, that the materials available to the committee may not have represented the totality of what was generated. The section was not elaborated further. It appeared near the end of the report. The pattern of institutional connection between the Manhattan Project's medical division, the AEC, the post-war research universities, and the emerging federal health research apparatus suggests not a conspiracy in the conventional sense, but something more structurally mundane and, in some ways, more difficult to address. A set of overlapping institutional interests that made disclosure consistently costly and silence consistently easier. The data that would have resolved the central question, what happened physiologically to the people who were injected, remained inside a system that had every administrative reason to maintain its boundaries. Part 4. There is a particular quality to the absence of data in a case like this. one that distinguishes it from the ordinary incompleteness that characterizes most historical records. When documents are lost to time, to fire, to institutional neglect, the gaps tend to be distributed irregularly. They appear across all categories of information, in all stages of a record's development, without obvious pattern. What the plutonium injection files present is something more specific, a record that is intact at its beginning and absent at its conclusion. The methodology survives, the administrative correspondence survives, the initial physiological measurements survive. What does not survive, or what was not made available, which is not the same thing, is the data that would have made the record scientifically complete. If the purpose of the program was to generate knowledge about how the human body responds to plutonium over time, then the missing follow-up data is not a peripheral omission. It is the omission of the program's primary scientific output. This observation does not require a particular theory of intent to be significant. It is significant regardless of whether the follow-up data was deliberately withheld, whether it was generated and then lost through institutional transition, or whether it was never collected, because the program's administrators concluded at some point that collection was no longer feasible or desirable. In each of those scenarios, the result is the same. The people who were injected, or, in most cases, their descendants, since the majority of the 1945 subjects did not survive into the era of declassification, were never told what had been placed into their bodies, and no independent scientific authority was ever able to determine what effect it had. The 1995 Advisory Committee report identified this as an ethical failure. It recommended that the surviving subjects and the families of deceased subjects be notified and provided with whatever information could be reconstructed from the available record. The implementation of that recommendation was incomplete. Several families were notified, several were not. The criteria by which cases were prioritized for notification were not made public in a form that allowed independent verification. What emerges from an extended examination of this record is not a simple narrative of wrongdoing and concealment. It is something more difficult to characterize, a picture of how institutions generate knowledge and simultaneously determine what that knowledge means, who has access to it, and what form it takes when it eventually becomes part of the historical record. The researchers who conducted the plutonium injections were not, in most cases, individuals who operated without any ethical framework. Several of them wrote, in their correspondence, about the importance of the research for protecting American workers from radiation exposure. Several of them expressed in internal communications some degree of discomfort with the conditions under which the studies were being conducted. The discomfort did not halt the studies. It did not alter the consent conditions. It did not produce a parallel record of dissent that might have created the kind of internal friction that historically precedes institutional disclosure. The data does not fully align with the interpretation that this was simply wartime expediency, a set of decisions made under pressure that was later corrected by the normal functioning of scientific and regulatory institutions. The studies continued after the war ended. They continued after the Nuremberg Code was published. The classification that protected them from external review was maintained through administrations of both parties, through multiple reorganizations of the federal science bureaucracy, and through a period of at least 40 years during which the patients who had been injected were alive, in some cases, and potentially accessible for the longitudinal follow-up that the program's own internal logic required. The follow-up did not occur in any documented form. If it occurred in an undocumented form, if the long-term health outcomes of the injection subjects were tracked through some mechanism that did not produce records that entered the public archive, then that data exists somewhere, in some form, in the administrative history of the institutions that succeeded the Manhattan Project's medical division. It has not been produced. The 1995 report represented the most thorough attempt to reconstruct the record that has been made publicly available. It was produced under a formal presidential mandate, with access to declassified materials, and with the participation of ethicists, historians, and scientists who were operating outside the institutional structures that had originally generated the program. Its conclusions were significant. Its limitations were also significant, and the report itself was candid about them. The committee could not determine the full scope of the studies. It could not identify all of the subjects. It could not establish the long-term health outcomes of the majority of the people who had been injected. It could not determine with certainty whether all relevant records had been transferred to the archive it was examining. These were not failures of the committee's methodology. They were the result of working with a record that had, over the preceding 5 decades, been shaped by forces that were not oriented toward the kind of transparency the committee was attempting to exercise. What remains after the review processes and the declassifications and the formal inquiries is a structure of knowledge that has a recognizable shape, complete at its origin, deliberate in its methodology, and absent precisely where the long arc of its consequences would be most legible. The people who were injected in 1945 have, in most cases, died. The institutions that administered the injections have been reorganized, renamed, and in some cases dissolved into successor agencies that do not maintain their predecessors' liability. The researchers who designed the program are gone. And the data, the longitudinal, decades-spanning biological data that would have been the program's most significant scientific output and its most significant ethical obligation, has not appeared in any public record. Whether it exists in a form that has not been made available, or whether it was never compiled, or whether it was compiled and then managed in the way the available correspondence suggests certain records were handled appropriately, is a question that the current documentary record cannot resolve.